All right, let's dive into something really different today. We're going to be looking at a fascinating, and you might even say controversial, history of our planet. It all comes from a scroll called The Replenishing of Earth, and it suggests a story that starts millions of years before the one most of us grew up with. And right off the bat, we're hit with this huge question. What if Genesis wasn't the beginning? I mean, really think about that for a second. This is the entire premise of the text we're exploring. It suggests that the book of Genesis isn't chapter 1, but just one chapter in a much, much longer saga of life on this planet. Okay, so the first thing you really gotta wrap your head around is how this scroll rethinks the name Adam. It's not one person's name. It's actually a title, ADMA. It's an Akkadian word that just means earthling, and it's a title given to the main figures at the start of every new age. This one little change completely reframes history as something cyclical, not just a straight line from beginning to end. So, where does this cyclical history even start? Well, according to the text, it kicks off with four massive eras, four great cycles of life and destruction that happened long, long before the events we read about in Genesis. So take a look at this table. It maps out that ancient timeline. And you can see a pattern right away, can't you? Some cycles just end, but others, they get wiped out. Look at the second cycle, led by Lamu and Lahamu. It ends with meteorite showers over 17 million years ago. Then the fourth cycle, under Anu and Antum, meets the exact same fate 14 million years ago. The planet just gets a hard reset. So after that fourth cataclysm, you have to wonder, did anyone make it? Where did they go? Well, the scroll gives a pretty wild answer. They retreated to a place called Shambhala, a hidden kingdom described as being right in the center of the earth. Okay, so that brings us to the fifth cycle. And this is where things might start to sound a little more familiar, because this is the era that the scroll lines up with the biblical story of Genesis. But there's a major twist. This version introduces a group of extraterrestrial beings called the Anunnaqi, and they completely change the story of where we came from. In this telling, the first Homo sapiens were called the Lulu Amalu, which literally means primitive workers. The story goes they were procreated by the Anunnaki about 49,000 years ago for a very specific job, to mine gold. They were later moved to this garden, but after they disobeyed the Anunnaki, bam, they were cast out. And here's the kicker. As punishment, 4 of their higher senses, things like telepathy and intuition, were just severed. Now, this slide gets to the heart of the argument, and it all comes down to one single word. On the right, you've got the King James Version many of us know, replenish the earth. But the translation from this scroll says, refill the planet Earth. See the difference? Refill implies it was already full before and got emptied. The author argues that this is proof, right there in the scripture, that there was a history before Adam. And that whole idea of refilling the planet leads us right into the next huge reset event. You guessed it, Noah and the Great Flood. In this version of history, this wasn't just a punishment. It was another necessary cycle of wiping the slate clean to replenish the earth. So why the flood? What was so bad that a total reset was needed? Well, the scroll lays out a pretty specific sequence of events. First, these giants called Nephilims show up from the Orion constellation. They forcibly take the daughters of the Adamites, and their children are born with these dual natures. The text claims this act corrupted everything, and humanity's thoughts just spiraled into selfishness, greed, and dishonesty. And the man at the center of this story, who we know as Noah, is called by his ancient Sumerian name, Utinefishtim. And here we see that central theme again. He's described as the new Adam of his time, the one chosen to kickstart the next cycle. This retranslation is a potential game changer for the story. The version we usually hear says, Noah walks with God. But this one, it says he spent his time in the company of the agreeable Eloheem Anunnaqi. That doesn't sound like a distant divine relationship. That sounds like a direct hands-on collaboration. And that collaboration, well, it gets really high-tech when it comes to the ark. This wasn't some simple wooden boat built to float. The scroll makes it clear. The Anunnaki instructed Utnapishtim to build a craft, and that they would then use their technology to levitate it out of the water, saving him and his family. A totally different picture, right? So the flood happens, the earth is refilled again, but the cycle keeps going. The scroll doesn't just stop in the ancient past. It traces the lineage after this great reset, connecting everything all the way up to a prophecy about our very near future.
And that Adam title gets even more specific here. The scroll calls Utnapishtim, Noah, the last Adam of what it calls the Nubian race. Then it points to his grandson, Canaan, and calls him the last Adam of the pale races. So it's describing these key figures as the starting points for different major lines of humanity.
Okay, so all of this, the cycles, the atoms, the Anunnaki, it's all building to one really specific point. The scroll makes a prophecy that the Anunnaki are coming back, and it gives a date, a very, very specific date, the year 2030. So how are they supposed to return? The prophecy describes this massive vessel called Nibiru. And get this, it's not a planet like some theories say, it's an enormous craft, a crystal city protected by a square force field. The text says it's way too big for our atmosphere, so it will send down 50 smaller passenger ships, called shams, to pick up what it calls worthy passengers from Earth. When you boil it all down, the single most important idea in this entire scroll is this pattern, this cycle of life, destruction, and then refilling the Earth. A pattern that supposedly goes back millions of years and points to a major event right around the corner for us. And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. If history really is a repeating cycle, what does the next one have in store for us?